Good evening and welcome to this latest lecture in the PIER 21-22 lecture series, and it's my real pleasure and privilege this evening to welcome Assistant Commissioner Matt Jiggs, Queen's Police Medal, whom I would classify as a dear friend and former colleague, and as many of you will now know, Matt has taken on the very challenging job within the Metropolitan Police of now becoming the Assistant Commissioner for Specialist Operations. Matt joined the Metropolitan Police Service in November of 2020 as an Assistant Commissioner, but that's after a previously distinguished career of 25 years in South Yorkshire Police, where he achieved the rank of Chief Superintendent before he then joined South Wales as an Assistant Chief Constable in 2010, where he then led the force's response to 3 miscarriages of justice, cases from the 1980s, and of course known or including the Cardiff 3 case. Matt was appointed a Deputy Chief Constable in August of 13 and then became Chief of South Wales in January of 2018. And South Wales Police during his time continued to be a highly regarded force, doing groundbreaking work in the use of automatic facial recognition. And nationally, Matt was responsible for the Mercury Digital Capabilities Programme in the National Counter-Terrorism Policing Command. Matt has been a champion of health and well-being in the wider service, and as the chair of Police Sport UK, he's been a leading voice on the link between physical activity and mental well-being. Matt, it's a real pleasure to have you join us this evening, and we certainly look forward to hearing about the latest challenges that you see, being the most senior police officer with responsibility for targeting the terrorism threat. Matt.
Thank you, Simon, very much for those kind words of introduction. As an Assistant Commissioner in the Met's Specialist Operations team, a central part of my job is to lead the counter-terrorism response for London, but as you described, I'm also the National Police Chiefs Council lead for counter-terrorism and head the CT policing network that spans the UK. I'm really delighted to have the opportunity to talk about what that means this evening in terms of coordinating our response and our approach, managing in the region of £1 billion of CT policing resources, and of course carrying our part of the UK government's contest strategy. Policing is just one facet of the multi-agency approach needed to protect the UK, of course, and we work in lockstep with MI5. They hold the lead for UK domestic security, and that's a partnership which has always been valuable, but since 2017 to the current day has responded to 14 attacks and prevented 32 others. I look forward to talking in more detail about how that collaboration works in practice a little later, but I did want to start by thanking again the Institute for inviting me to speak this evening. It certainly comes at an interesting moment in time. We've recently seen the 20th anniversary of arguably the most significant moment in counter-terrorism history, the attacks on 9/11 in 2001, attacks which resonated around the world, and many of you will be able to think back and remember where you were when you first saw the harrowing news and the accompanying footage. My first posting in security and counter-terrorism started the week before 9/11, and I vividly remember after the first impact standing around a small TV screen in a special branch office watching the awful scenes of the second impact. And I recall immediately feeling this was a moment on which history would pivot for years ahead, and of course so it proved to be. I also remember the rapid change that event catalysed, and in the 2 decades since, I've seen counter-terrorism change progressively, but the most dramatic changes that I have seen have happened in the wake of terrible and shocking tragedies from 9/11, 2005 and 2017, and even since. So with that in mind, I wanted to talk this evening about how the nature of the threat has in some ways changed and evolved, and yet leaves us in other ways with aspects of a threat that feels sadly familiar. The headlines reflect the way in which the CT threat has changed since 9/11 in many ways, and we've moved from complex plots that involved lots of moving parts, which were often directed from overseas to those conceived now in the minds of lone individuals. Many of those people have proven vulnerable to the vast amount of material available to them, both legitimately and illegitimately, on the internet. And often there's far less ideological impetus, or certainly less certainty and less of a singular ideological focus in these plots, yet in many respects they have their own very devastating impact. There's certainly little doubt that in the past 6 years we've seen the fastest evolution and diversification of the threat in living memory, from the emergence of ISIS and their sophisticated media strategy to exploit vulnerable targets, to the rise of the right-wing terrorist threat and single-issue terrorism, and increasingly hostile state activity like the Salisbury poisonings. So we do find ourselves at an interesting moment in time, and one which calls for us to use every tool we have available for us to cooperate globally, but also locally, so we can spot and stop an act of terror, both using our expansive digital capabilities, but also by working with new partners, people who are on the ground in communities every day, perhaps working in education or in social care. We've got to turn our eyes to the future, of course, and ask whether we are prepared to face a new age of the terrorist threat, one dominated by technological advances and the borderless, unregulated spaces of the internet. As the threat changes, that means we have to too. We certainly need a wider collaboration across society, across business, and beyond that to respond effectively. So the threat may be different, but our primary defence remains the same: teamwork and information sharing between those of us charged with protecting our citizens from terrorism. But I will talk about new partnerships that remain incredibly important. The UK's own counter-terrorism operation was forged out of the crucibles of the so-called Troubles and the persisting campaigns of terrorism both in Northern Ireland and on the mainland of Britain, of course. And whilst our threat faced from there remains severe, the ideologies of those who wish to do us harm through terrorism are, of course, much more diverse than during that period and even then 2001. To see this, you only need to look at the terror plots foiled by CT policing and our intelligence service partners since 2017. 18 involving Islamist terrorism, 12 linked to extreme right-wing terrorism, and 2 from other forms of single-issue terrorism. These figures demonstrate just how diverse the terror threat has become. And while the last 20 years has largely been dominated by the rapid growth in the Islamist terrorist threat globally, more recently we've seen a matching or certainly growing threat from extreme right-wing terrorism. Not only have we seen the ideology which drives terrorist change, but we've also seen terrorists shift in their tactics as well. 9/11 precipitated an increase in complex attacks targeting aircraft, and we also saw international groups such as Al-Qaeda emboldened to direct attacks on foreign soil, of course, carrying out complex and large-scale explosive or marauding firearms attacks. And sadly, of course, we endured those in 2005, the 7/7 bombings, complex, coordinated and devastating. 8 years separated those events, the 7/7 bombings and the attacks at the Tiger Bar and Glasgow Airport, and then the murder of Lee Rigby in 2013. 2016 saw the appalling murder of MP Joe Cox by a right-wing extremist, and in March 2017 we saw the first of 5 attacks that year, the Westminster Bridge attack. And since those 5 attacks there have been 2 very high-profile Islamist attacks in 2018 in London and Manchester, where no one was killed, 2 attacks in 2019, the Christchurch-inspired right-wing attack in Surrey, and an Islamist attack, sadly, at Fishmongers Hall, where 2 people were murdered. These events, of course, fill headlines for moments, stay with families forever, and it's worth remembering then that in 2020 we saw further attacks, even during and around the pandemic. 3 Islamist terrorist attacks, the first 2 attempted murders in Streatham High Road and in the prison HMP Whitemoor, and the latter of those involving attacks on prison officers. The former resulted in the subject under surveillance being shot by the police, but not before he'd managed to wound and traumatise innocent members of the public. A third attack in Reading in 2020, again we saw in seconds the perpetrator murder 3 men before being arrested. He may never be released, but those families have been handed a whole life sentence. In 2021, to bring this very sad chronology almost up to date, we saw 2 further attacks. The appalling murder of Sir David Amess MP whilst he served his community in Southend, and the attempted bombing, the explosion of an improvised explosive device at the Liverpool Women's Hospital. We saw over Christmas events at Windsor, and we of course have seen events in the last weeks in Texas. The chronology illustrates to me that the threat of international groups directing attacks on foreign soil of course remains, but the power and influence and inspiration that they bring is still very significant. So despite the dismantling of key international terrorist networks, they leave a legacy reflected in the events that I have just described of terrorist propaganda, which is fueling self-radicalisation across the world. And that desire to inspire rather than direct, as well as an increase in the powers of us to disrupt those actions, is of course driven by the change in terrorist methodology. It's driving a change in our need for new tactics to respond to lower sophistication attacks using knives and vehicles and weapons, which are becoming more prevalent. So whilst we see technology in both our tools and in the inspiration and radicalisation of terrorists as key, we also see relatively low levels of sophistication in many of the most recent attacks. Of course, we have seen in the devastating consequences in Manchester in 2017 and elsewhere around the world, the threat from explosives, firearms attacks and other complex plots still looms large. But low sophistication attacks inspired by the proliferation of online extremist material can certainly reduce the process of radicalisation and attack planning from years to weeks, dramatically narrowing the window which we have to identify and neutralise a threat. So put simply, cells of well-trained terrorists and sophisticated attack planning are absolutely still a problem, but absolutely no longer the problem. We've now got to consider vulnerable, often young minds, contagious ideas thrown together in a permissive environment. So I wanted to talk for a few minutes about those permissive spaces, the spaces that allow domestic and global content to reach people here in the UK. The most significant change in context, of course, in that respect has been brought about not by terrorist groups or actors, by international conflicts or the traditional drivers of terrorism, but by technology. The internet's eroded the physical barriers that would once have restricted terrorists, the international borders, the need for clandestine meetings, the face-to-face communication that made up their methodology. Online, the threat picture is much more complex. We've seen the threat fragment away from well-resourced and organised structures into smaller, closed groups with different ideologies and no clear physical base or leadership structure. And we can see that particularly clearly recently in the extreme right-wing threat in the UK, where since the prescription of national action in 2016, we've seen splinter groups form and break apart almost as quickly as we in policing and the security service can identify and target them. Away from the UK, the internet has absolutely globalised extremism. It's proliferated the spread of extremist ideologies, and it's made it possible for anyone with an internet connection to reach into the lives of people halfway around the world. And none of this, of course, helped by an age of skepticism, of misinformation, where the vulnerable and isolated are in the middle of a perfect storm. That, of course, sadly, we see puts them in the path of hateful ideologies. So, in short, the attacks we're seeing may be at one level less sophisticated, but the social, political grievances driving those and driving individuals with hostile intentions and how those grievances develop has never been more complex. The effect of that online radicalisation is to produce terrorism that's away from that past model of groups and cells, is much more individual, much more dispersed, and at one level might seem to be apparently random. So the character of our work is shifting to a focus on high volumes of risk, acute at times, but because of its nature, chronic and enduring. And it's worth saying that some of the features of the threat we face today are absolutely enduring. It's a great source of sadness to all of us who are involved to look at the tropes that are present in 21st century extreme right-wing terrorism, for example, and see that they run to centuries old themes of anti-Semitism and other very long-standing biases, discriminatory narratives and forms of hate. Whilst those features have tragically endured, we see aspects of the threat shifting significantly, partly in the way that I've described, in the move to lower sophistication attacks. But in particular, we see that the globalization of extremism, the reach of the internet, has also reached a new generation. And in the UK and indeed across the world, we've seen increasing numbers of children, individuals who are under 18 drawn towards terrorist material and activity. So we've seen 14-year-old convicted of directing an attack in Australia, to teenage leaders of extreme right-wing groups that are so dangerous they've been prescribed in the UK. And there's absolutely no doubt that those attitudes and intentions have been formed through the exposure to online material. In the UK, children, and let's remember we are talking about children under the age of 18, made up around 1 in 8, 13% of all the terrorism arrests we made in the year up to the 31st of March 2021. And that reflected nearly a trebling from just 5% in the previous year. So the sense is, potentially, particularly during the pandemic, that whilst terrorism arrests across every other age group have fallen as a result of that pandemic, children are the group, the only demographic, which has shown an increase. We can all, of course, imagine why that might be, with the forms of isolation which the pandemic has driven, and I'll touch on that again in a moment. The change in target audience is not only limited, I should say, to children and young people, and we are also seeing people experiencing mental ill health being drawn into terrorism when they're at their most vulnerable. And I know that we're joined online by a number of academic colleagues who would be able to speak much more fluently about some of these issues, but absolutely what I see in our casework, what I see in the online hate that drives it, is a set of connecting grievance narratives which all inspire a hatred of others and all speak to some sense of isolation and reduced worth, some loss, and then search for identity in the groups that proliferate online. The shift that I've described, the shift from more sophisticated attack planning in the main, and the shift in the demographic of those involved, perhaps reflects that terrorists, of course, understand that high sophistication attack planning creates higher risks of detection and disruption. And to achieve your aims as a terrorist, as those who seek to inspire terrorist action in others, smaller, low sophistication attacks carried out in short timeframes with greater frequency have all served to have enormous effect. And that effect has been brought about despite incredible international efforts by the pumping out of vast quantities of propaganda targeting those who are susceptible to influence because of that sense of anger, because of that sense of exploitation, of dislocation being exploited. And the material, from whether it's from the extreme right wing or from the Islamist terrorist sources, is absolutely clearly designed to resonate with the experiences and challenges people are facing in their everyday life, to exacerbate those grievances and to attract what we might see as lost souls looking for that identity, looking for acceptance, looking for belonging, who feel isolated and rejected. And none of that, I've got to say, requires the propaganda to be particularly coherent or sophisticated. And yet I have seen and talked to many colleagues about content which is increasingly very cynically slick and eye-catching. Content which reflects, for example, the form of video games and the kind of online material which is bound to grab the attention of young people in particular. Children and young people with mental health problems are particularly vulnerable to that deluge of extremist material, and we're seeing that absolutely in our prevent data and in conviction. So in the year to March 2020, more than half of all prevent referrals were classed as being from a mixed, unstable or unclear ideology, more than our other categories put together. And that relates very much to the instances where we see people exhibit a combination of ideologies and shifting between ideologies, or where there is no coherence in the ideology that they are adopting. That was a much smaller portion as little as 5 years ago. So we're definitely witnessing a significant change in the way that radicalisation is occurring within society and the way that individuals are self-radicalising. Certainly less present is that singular ideology driving extremism, and individuals are looking to and finding various different ideologies or extremist narratives online. I suspect some of that is because we're getting better, some of our appreciation of that is because we're getting better at spotting and categorising these types of cases, but it also describes the growth in that material online. What is enduring, and I've talked about some features that endure, are some of the features that are often consistently present in our casework. Vulnerability, social isolation, problems in people's own lives, their mental health issues, their complex needs and their behavioural disorders. If we look at these factors, then we can absolutely see that the pandemic we are still living through and the strictures of the restrictions and isolation we've lived through over the past 2 years are bound to have far-reaching consequences in respect of the CT threat. There's no doubt that over the last 2 years we've seen a period when those who are already isolated or have chosen to be isolated have been compelled to and have spent even more time alone, often consuming online hate. And I think it's fair to say, therefore, that COVID-19 has contributed to an environment in the UK in which extremists have been able to have potentially found it easier to identify and radicalise young people. And those young people have had less contact with the kind of support mechanisms, the vital social contact which they experience in schools in particular, but through other forms of social contact that would mitigate those risks. There's been, alongside that, a reduction in their access to support services such as mental health provision, social care, for a range of vulnerable people, not just young people, for long periods. And that is absolutely a concern to those of us working in counter-terrorism. Those factors have had real world implications, and in the first lockdown we saw referrals into the Prevent programme fall by 50% and then surge back in the months afterwards. It's really not clear to us at this stage how widespread the impact on the nation's mental well-being, of course, is, nor how that will impact on the CT threat. But what we do know is we have absolutely seen an uptick in demand and operational tempo, and effectively we are operating at pre or above pandemic levels of casework. And all of that casework lands with us at a time when we're still reflecting on the consequences of the chronology, the history, the tragedy that I described from 2017 to 2020. There were difficult lessons and messages from the Westminster, London Bridge and Fistmongers Hall inquests, the Manchester Public Arena inquiry is only part heard, and we're hearing evidence, of course, which demonstrates that there is much for us to have learned. We've acted on many of those lessons already, but much still to do. In 6 years behind us, there have been over 500 recommendations from multiple reviews, not least those surrounding the 2017 attacks and the review work which was undertaken by counter-terrorism policing and MI5 at the time afterwards, particularly at the same time as we were handling, particularly complex, because at the same time we were handling a huge volume of investigations and plots. There are, in those 500 recommendations, clear themes. Firstly, it's clear that we must continue to focus on the way we collect, analyse and use data, and then share it inside the national security machine and then outside with partners who could be the vital key. And every inquest picks up on a failure to communicate between agencies at some point. And well, certainly every one of the critical inquests has done that. And demonstrate in many instances that the key, the clue to stopping a terrorist is as likely to be found with a doctor, a teacher or a social worker in their reports as it is in a national security database. The second consistent theme is partnership, mobilising not just national security partners, but the business community, the public in a whole society response. Not least because we need people to be alert to the reconnaissance and planning, the purchases made by terrorists who can sometimes seem to be unremarkable figures, but also because in all those actions there are clues left to their intent that we just might not see. And the reality remains that it is friends and family who are most likely to see those changes in behaviour. The series of themes from the inquest and reviews continues. The prevalence of extreme right-wing terrorism, the widening focus away solely from the Islamist terrorist threat. And we've been forced to confront collectively gaps in our protection of public spaces. Lots of our public spaces, as we saw in Manchester, have multiple owners and require, but don't always demonstrate, a sense of shared and collective responsibility. The themes continue. We've seen mixed appetites by social media giants, the mega tech companies, to address online harm, the kind of harm that's spread in that radicalising material that I've described. And we have seen progress that I'll return to, but several cases highlight the risks that a committed terrorist can pose, and committed terrorists, even after convicted, can radicalise others, whether that's from a prison cell or online, and can still be committed to carry out further acts after they have themselves been released from prison. And as I've alluded to, a further theme from all of these cases and our casework is that this threat's no longer mainly around trained and directed individuals, individuals who've been trained and directed overseas, but mostly by the inspiration, the mobilisation, tragically, of domestic British-born younger boys and men through social media. I've spoken at some length now about the complex problems we face and how some of those are becoming more complex and need sophisticated solutions. That's why the UK government's contest strategy is such a multifaceted programme, a programme which we support in all its elements, and certainly our work after 2017 emphasised that we couldn't do that alone. So the responsibility for stopping terrorism absolutely can't rest with the police or security services alone. We do need local government, wider law enforcement, businesses, communities, and active citizen support. We've tragically seen that as security around some of our historic targets, such as aviation, has hardened, attacks have shifted to public places. And so I'll touch for a moment on one of the strands of the contest strategy, Protect. The UK has got over 600,000 publicly accessible locations, many of which we could never imagine being protected by airport-style security. And so as we harden our security at obvious iconic venues, we inevitably push terrorists to look elsewhere, to crowded places and to potential targets. Fishmongers Hall, Streatham High Road, Stanwell Car Park, the Reading Public Gardens were simple attacks in public places with little or no formal security. To counter that kind of threat, we need new partnerships and reinforced partnerships, important existing partnerships with local authorities, with businesses, with major events organisers, so that they have in place appropriate counter-terrorism measures. We are hugely supportive of the proposed Protect duty and believe that security applied consistently and at scale does need and will benefit from a legal framework placing responsibility on owners, administrators of potential targets to improve protective security and organisational preparedness in a proportionate way. And it's right that those who are going to be responsible owners work to keep the public safe, and of course that needs to be proportionate and collaborative. We will talk often, and you'll see the very physical signs of that security. Hostile vehicle mitigation, as it's known, concrete blocks, as it appears to you and I, will be important, but equally important is the training of staff to take swift action to protect individuals at low or no cost in the event of an attack. Simply taking those steps can save lives. Change at that scale, of course, can only be done by having a real resolve and ambition to prevent more people becoming victims, and it absolutely doesn't have to mean costly physical security. Staff training using products that are freely available online will make a huge difference. The security community, the private security, will play a huge part in making sure that CT guidance reaches the corners of the UK, and we will play our part in making sure that that guidance is cheap and easy and intuitive and accessible. We've worked hard already to provide online tools that can be used at scale. You'll see our strapline, Action Counters Terrorism Act, has been deployed to a brand new suite of free online tools, and those tools and that learning can be accessed in as little as 45 minutes so that staff have the knowledge and confidence to spot and report suspicious behaviour, to understand what to do if attacked and how to make a plan. And those simple measures could be absolutely the difference between life and death. We've got over 10,000 organisations registered for that, with over 600,000 learners having completed 2 million modules of training. So already a great deal of progress, but we are really positive about the Protect duty and all that it can do to secure our public spaces. We need some of that same approach, of course, to protecting vulnerable individuals and vulnerable minds, and that means an approach to what starts to look like comorbidity, the presence of other vulnerabilities, spotting the vulnerabilities of individual early and giving them the tools they need to build structure and resilience. The methodology for all of that has changed, and of course, as I've described, so has the terrorist typology. We're no longer fighting the same threat as we did post 9/11. The lone actor terrorist we've described is absolutely our first concern. And in fact, we talk less now about lone actors. It's often inaccurate description, and we find that few have truly ever been alone, never expressed their intention to someone else, never received any kind of inspiration or support from anybody else. And we talk more now about the self-initiated. They might carry out their final act alone, but they seldom arise in a vacuum. Often they've telegraphed those intentions elsewhere, and often they represent the violent end product of an on or offline radicalizer. The other feature of lone actor as a form of language is that it suggested that it was impossible to predict, see or stop individuals, and that's just not true. They may be hard to stop, hard to see, but not impossible. And the dispersal of Daesh has reduced but not eradicated the online influence and their influence of their tactics. And we've, of course, as I've described, seen a great deal of material still available online. But we are beginning to understand the difference between tackling the self-initiated terrorist and terrorist cells. And we're starting to see that whilst their ideological positioning and consistency is different from the former group, much more volatile, potentially more shallow, more unpredictable, they're also potentially less likely to be seen by us immediately, maybe less likely to be known by close contacts. But what we do absolutely know is that we have people in the lives of individuals who can see and sense that change, and their confidence to engage with authorities, to feel confident that their information will be treated responsibly and carefully, is therefore hugely important now, as it has been since the notion of prevent first entered our language. We certainly will not rely on any one of the 4 Ps, prevent, pursue, protect, prepare. We will never rely on any one in isolation. We're determined around the pursuit of active terrorists and those who plan terrorist acts. Lengthy prison sentences absolutely have their place, but we know also that extremism can flourish in prisons. Mental health treatment can absolutely play a part, but we shouldn't be too dependent on the idea that we can mitigate all risks through that. We see lots of features of other harm in our casework: addiction, other forms of disadvantage, poor health, education, employment. If we can remedy and intervene on those fronts, we can redress some of the isolation that people feel, some of the sense of exclusion, the anger, and potentially their violence. At one level, all risks, but another, all opportunities for us working with a range of partners and for society to intervene. And so whilst I deal with every day this incredibly troubling reality, I'm absolutely not downhearted. We are talking about a group of individuals often who might at one level feel like they can escalate quickly to action, but in many senses describe vulnerabilities that society as a whole is working hard to address, carry ideologies or motivations which are shallow, newly acquired, and can be intervened with if we have skilled intervention providers. That will require us to do a number of things which are difficult for some of the partners that we would want to work with. Sharing sensitive information across partners with different levels of vetting adds to the complications, of course. But an example of how we're doing that is in groundbreaking work, which aims to better understand the links between mental health and radicalisation, and we deliver that through vulnerability support services. And that places mental health professionals alongside prevent practitioners to help us identify and triage those with mental ill health away from the criminal justice system and towards the support that will make the greatest difference. And the statistics to support that approach, which in its own way can sometimes seem controversial, are clear. Since launching in 2016, we've learned that around 70% of the people referred to prevent have a concern which requires that kind of vulnerability support from clinicians, with around 25% having mental ill health identified as their primary vulnerability. So we're working hard to understand that complex interplay. We're drawing on 20 years of experience there, work with multi-agency public protection arrangements, work that has sought to reduce the threat from sex offenders, for example, living in our communities in a multi-agency partnership that requires better health support, education, training, critical thinking skills to put in place a different narrative for individuals. We also know that those measures will never be complete, will never completely mitigate a threat. And so we'll have alongside them an emphasis on compliance with legal restrictions, on monitoring, and they will all play their important part on managing convicted terrorists in our communities. So whilst it's lazy to resort to a description of hard or soft measures, the reality is we need a broad suite of interventions, and I described many of those. New tactics then in that mix, and a great deal of change in 20 years. Whilst the internet's created all the problems I've described, COVID has overlain unforeseen complexity, and recent global events remind us that old threats remain poised to return. We look, of course, to the regions which have presented challenges to us all in the past, striking 20 years after 9/11 and the beginning of the so-called war on terror, that we're once again thinking about events in Afghanistan and how might they impact on the safety and security of British citizens. It's too early to say what that impact will be, but it would not be the first time that we've seen, of course, for all that I've described, the domestic threat, international events impacting on the UK threat picture. And as counter-terrorism policing and our security services, we're monitoring that situation very closely, of course, to spot emerging threats. So having crossed some of those tiles that are on the screen, a description of the emerging threat, the way that global conversations online are impacting on particularly young people in our communities who have felt themselves isolated during the pandemic, and therefore our need to be able to both respond to that, but also protect the public in public spaces. I wanted to close with a few more minutes just in relation to the strength of our existing partnerships and the new coalitions which we're forming. The greatest strength lies in our partnership as policing with our intelligence agencies with whom we work hand in glove, and that's enabled, of course, by oversight and safeguards from elected officials. It's a partnership between policing and intelligence agencies which has grown substantially since 2001, and every day of every week sees us working together to understand our intelligence picture and for policing to play its part as the executive element of that partnership, strengthening the overall ability of us to address the terrorist threat by putting compelling evidence before the courts. We're seeing incredible success in that regard, but more to do. And we'll soon take that relationship to its next level by co-locating agencies responsible for national security in a single state-of-the-art facility called the Counter-Terrorism Operations Centre, CTOC, in London. CTOC's been born out of the 2017 attacks as an integrated, partnership-driven, purpose-built working environment, bringing the right people, skills and technology together to strengthen our ability to protect the UK. It's an evolution, and to some extent will place us in a revolutionary position, a world-beating position to address the threats we face. It means that we will work ever closer with those existing partners, but also with those who work in health, education, partners in the prisons and probation service who can help us deal with that wider cohort of individuals who may be vulnerable in the way that I've described. That will need some change on our part, daring to share more intelligence in those new partnerships and the complexity of the increasing presence of mental ill health, complex demands, meaning new tactics are required. And I talked largely about our ability, therefore, to foster partnerships in the UK, domestic partnerships, and they are our principal focus from a policing perspective. And whilst partnerships at home are absolutely of central importance, partnerships overseas remain vital, and counter-terrorism policing has liaison officers around the world. Much of the threat we face is global, it's borderless, it's in the unregulated spaces of the internet, and that's a threat that we share and wrestle with partners all over the world. We're working with military forces, governments, law enforcement, intelligence agencies, but also those new coalitions that I've described. Old partnerships, new coalitions, families, communities, teachers, clinicians, business leaders, and in particular, as I get towards closing, the corporations who control the online platforms which we all rely on to communicate and connect with each other. Tech companies and social media platforms have become much better at working alongside law enforcement and governments to help protect people against a huge range of online threats, but there is so much more they can and must do. They have got power, they have got resources. We've spoken at length from a UK policing perspective about the risks posed by end-to-end encryption, which is becoming ubiquitous across many social media platforms. And I know, and would never duck the issue, that engages the age-old debate, the balance between privacy and security, but of course a third leg in that balance, profit. So I hope and we continue to work to ensure that the tech industry rises to the challenge to do even more around public protection, to make progress. And if that progress is off the pace, then for governments to come together to do something about that. Like many governments, the UK is trying to grapple with how we can make the internet and our use of technology safer for everyone. And you'll see much of that expressed in a new online safety bill. And like everything we do in counter-terrorism, we will need to do that coming together under international frameworks, and we will need to do it in ways which have the trust and confidence of our communities. That is an enduring feature of my last 20 years in, out and around this work. We should never and could never do this work without the support of communities who truly defeat terrorism in the end. The threat's evolved, it's more complex, it's continuously evolving. It absolutely preys on the vulnerable and is fueled by the extremist content online. We need to tackle that threat an expanded global societal coalition to face that challenge, and we'll do that based on a sound foundation from the last 20 years, and we'll do it with communities, but we'll also do it with the insights we take from academic partnership and academic work, and we'll always seek to do it in a way that reflects the accountability and ethics of our democracy. So these are not strategies to form or to execute in isolation. And so with gratitude for the 45 minutes or so I've taken to describe where the threat stands today, the challenges we face and our hopes for the future in tackling it. I'm grateful for your time, look forward to questions, and would like to thank you very much.
Matt, thank you very much indeed for a really insightful and thoroughly interesting 45 minutes. And as I was listening, it won't come as any great surprise that I was reflecting on the challenges that I've faced as the last 8 years as the MPCC leader around child protection, and particularly the threats around child sexual abuse and the synergy between the challenges that you face in terms of the radicalisation of young people, whereby they go out and seek to plan or actually commit a terrorist atrocity. And I reflected, I just wonder, Matt, whether or not we've got it joined up in the most effective way, because it's so easy for us to just turn around and say, well, the terrorism response is the responsibility of the counter-terrorism experts, where actually it's all our business, in the same way that tackling and spotting the signs of domestic abuse and the impact that it has is everybody's business as well. And I wonder if there isn't now the time and the space, maybe we should start prompting a slightly different debate, where we start to talk about the role and responsibilities of professionals becoming have a far broader responsibility, and to have the courage and the confidence to flag up their concerns, where actually the early intervention, as we all know, can have a really positive effect.
Yeah, I think absolutely, we see the vulnerability to radicalisation as an element of overall vulnerability, the same vulnerability, particularly for young people, which exposes them to risk of child sexual exploitation, of criminal exploitation, and we should see that in the round. We should see it in the round in their lives, when they are in or out of and falling out of education, and we should see it in their lives online. And the same sense of responsibility we need from the big tech companies is one which would address many of the threats which you describe. And we are, of course, as policing professionals with the National Crime Agency and other chief officer leads, seeking to join up this conversation about online harms, so that we create an environment which is hostile to those who would do harm and doesn't allow the kind of content to flourish in sometimes some relatively accessible and open spaces, which then might lead people to the closed and darker corners of the internet.
Thank you. Now, Matt, given the evolution of terrorism that you've described, from the old Al-Qaeda style to new forms of self-radicalisation, lone actors, where do you see the next threat coming from?
I think one of the challenges we face is that there is so much material online which places distance between people, the polarization of everything online, every debate online, and much of that, of course, is driving mistrust of government and mistrust of institutions, and we see that emerge in the extreme right-wing narratives, but we see it in other forms of extremist ideology. So certainly we need to be very alive to those single issue ideologies, to that kind of rhetoric, which is about putting distance between people and wider society and the institutions of the state. So that is at one level very domestic, but what we do see is in examples like the right-wing space, we see that being connected up. So you see US-based right-wing or extreme right-wing organisations and their communication reaching the UK. That was never the case with and you and I will probably remember dealing with some forms of right-wing extremism over decades. They were essentially very much British and about Britain, despite some connections to that history that I've described, and so despite some European connections. They were principally domestic, and now that conversation is global. So I think we will need to keep our eyes to the polarisation of the online debate, the anti-government rhetoric and anti-rule of law rhetoric. But I'm afraid to say, some things just endure as well. So we of course will need to pay really close attention to what happens in unstable regions of the world, and we all need to pay really close attention to the way that we exit this period where people have been very isolated, and we in truth none of us know what people have consumed during that time. So it's harder to the future is very hard to predict, isn't it? It's hard to say where that future threat comes from, but we can see some trends in the current work, which means it's becoming more and more diverse.
And Matt, just in terms of those different forms of ideology, which one would you say is on the rise amongst radicalised individuals?
It's a difficult question to answer for one particular reason, which is that it's hard to say whether our ability to see threats better is reflected in our casework, or whether it's an increase. The biggest single group rising are the people who have a really twisted sort of pick and mix ideology. So there's a bit of anti-establishment, anti-government. There'll be some anti-Semitism in there. They might be drawn to an Islamist narrative, and they bring all of that together. So this group we describe as mixed, unstable, unclear are actually the largest cohort, where rather than having very clear ideologies, they have a sense of being isolated, excluded, a sense of grievance, and pick from these different sources their grievance. And that is to the figures, that is the group which is growing greatest. We've seen an increase in our casework and in the caseworker partners of the extreme right-wing threat. But it is important to say, on balance, the Islamist terrorist threat with its complex drivers around the world is still a very real and present danger.
And I think we would all, well, I would certainly recognise that. And just in terms of that, the identification of that pathway and our ability to intervene at an early stage. And you talked about the increase in arrest of children involved in terrorism. Can you talk a little bit about what we're doing in that space to maybe identify that pathway to offending, and what we're specifically doing to target children to prevent them becoming radicalised?
Yeah, I mean, a huge amount of this, of course, has to do with individual and collective sense of identity, of community cohesion, of all the other forms of vulnerability. So we're working very closely with partners in schools and in higher and further education institutions. And it's really important to say, I mean, in the roots of Prevent, a lot of challenge about whether it was spying on communities. Our concern is to intervene to reduce vulnerability, to safeguard individuals, and through that safeguard wider communities. So lots of conversations that are now present, whether they're in curriculum or whether they take place as a response to particular events, reflect the fact that we know we need to talk to young people about global events. I mean, they are engaged, they're engaged online. The largest group of referrals we get outside of policing and our traditional partners into Prevent is from education, and many of those demonstrate the care and concern that the teaching profession feel to make sure that young people are supported at a moment at which they might be vulnerable. That can take the form of religious mentoring, support around critical thinking, but the one thing that we absolutely, working with a Home Office who own the Prevent strategy, want to do is make sure there are interventions available that allow young people to express where their grievance is and work through it. We have to do that because we want to stop people on that pathway. We don't want to wait until we're at a stage where we detect real risks. So a set of interventions, and as you'll know, and others online will know, in terms of reducing offending or reoffending, some of the interventions are consistently about health support, housing, about access to training and employment. So at one level, terrorism is a very unusual form of offending, but another, many of the interventions we've applied elsewhere are absolutely relevant to supporting young people move away from those risks.
And would you say that the terrorism in the UK is still very much a homegrown phenomena?
The attacks and our casework are dominated by British nationals. The vast majority of them British born. So it is the case that we should be careful for a whole set of policy reasons and operational reasons not to think that terrorism is something that happens because people from elsewhere come into the UK and pose a threat.
Yeah.
There are, of course, instances of that happening, and there's a risk of people from the UK travelling to places where terrorist activity is underway, where conflicts are underway, and we saw that, of course, in Syria, and then returning to the UK. And the UK, for a variety of reasons, will be a target for international terrorism. But we have to see this as a problem which we own as a society in the UK. But those international links are critical because people do move across borders, and also because the inspiration and fueling of the radicalisation that takes place is absolutely an international phenomenon.
Yeah, that's interesting. And one of the questions that I've been asked is that the gender profile of terrorism would appear to be almost exclusively male.
Yes.
Is there any suggestion that females are becoming involved in terrorism?
I mean, we absolutely see and have seen over a number of years the exposure of women to the same radicalising influences, sometimes the coercion of women into terrorist groups and their exploitation. So we see a few women in the data. What I would say is we see a lot of male violence, and we see in particular, and have studied recently, the presence of domestic abuse in our casework. So in referrals into the Prevent programme, 1 in 3 of those referrals demonstrates a history of domestic abuse, either as perpetrator, witness or victim, and the biggest cohort is as perpetrator. So we see a lot of violent misogyny in the right wing, in the extreme right wing rhetoric. We see violent misogyny in some of the Islamist terrorist narratives, and some appalling treatment of women in places where that has flourished. So, of course, female terrorists grab the headlines because they're unusual, but I think we have to confront, and I'm keen in the year ahead to confront the reality that terrorism is another form of male violence.
Now, this is something that's very close to my heart. Do you foresee that the introduction of the online safety bill will mean that removing or reducing anti-terrorism propaganda on overt social media will drive recruiters to disseminate the same material on more underground or encrypted platforms? And will this make the job of Prevent even harder?
I believe that our casework shows that there are individuals who are drawn to those darker corners, those closed corners from the overt, from the habitat that exists of overt material, which may be below the threshold. I mean, let's be clear, we have good success with social media platforms with material that breaches the Terrorism Act. If people are glorifying or promoting terrorism or sharing material that would be useful for terrorists, most responsible social media companies are good at taking that down. However, in the platforms which are closed or semi-open and very accessible, the forums that exist on a variety of social media platforms, for obvious reasons, I'm not going to advertise any of them, but those create a habitat in which people are drawn into and then are led away to the areas where the most troubling conversations and content exist. So it's a long way of saying, Simon, it's a good question, but both my instinct and experience is if we shut down those overt spaces and reduce the amount of harmful content available there, we will reduce the access and appeal for an important cohort to the plainly illegal and often more difficult to access material. So, let's not kid ourselves. They're in those encrypted closed spaces anyway. So, those exist whether we like it or not. What we don't want to do is have big signposts to them in the open space.
Yeah. Okay. Look, and I agree with that. I think if we make it harder, then that will deter people, and that for me is so important. It really is. Now, I've got a question here, Matt, from somebody very new in service. What would be your top tip on supporting the bigger work that the CT teams are doing?
Well, I mean, one thing that is just really clear to me, and it's good to know we've got a colleague online. The one thing which is clear is that changes in local communities, the suspicious activity that we'll see, are most obvious to people who know the place that they're working in, know the people that they're working with, and know the signs and signals. So for me, we get invaluable intelligence because frontline police officers go into a domestic dispute. I've described how present that is, and see Nazi memorabilia in a bedroom or in a flat. We get invaluable intelligence because security guards and frontline police officers spot somebody who's taking photographs in a place that makes no sense of a government building or paying too much attention to CCTV cameras. And we see people who are working in local communities, engaged with community groups, with faith groups, with schools and colleges, hearing signals and picking up the signals that somebody's behaviour is changing. So to a colleague online, I would say, I would absolutely want every police officer in the UK to be a counter-terrorism officer. I think every police officer in the UK is a counter-terrorism officer because their feet are on the ground in the communities and they are the eyes and ears. And the other thing which they can do is look at those online materials, the action counter-terrorism materials. There's fantastic training, not just for the security profession that I've described or for others, but for frontline police officers as well.
Great. Now, Matt, there's a question here. Do you think that the policing structure in the UK supports the best response to CT policing?
It's a brilliant question, which I've wrestled with along with colleagues for 25, 26 years. And there are I think the counterterrorism network absolutely describes a success in working with the existing structures, principally centrally funded from government, but delivered by a partnership between local police forces operating in regions and of course those other partners that I've described. So there, at one level, you could argue that is us making it work. But at another, I think it expresses a profound feature of the model we have, which is it's built from community policing upwards in the way that I've described. And I think if we were a single national, transnational agency, which is the obvious other way to organise, we would have to work so much harder to maintain those links to local communities, to develop a profession and investigators who have an instinct for those investigations and the way that they work in communities. So I'm also a pragmatist in this respect. The debate about whether the policing structure in the UK is the right one has has been around my entire service and many years before. And what I'm proud to be a part of and proud to lead is a network which demonstrates that with the right commitment and the right commitment to collaboration, it can be made to work at both a local, regional, national and indeed transnational level.
And Matt, my final question for this evening, and it comes from Anna T. Says, "Hello, great update on the subject. I wonder if you find difficulties with mental health services reluctant to sharing information due to patient confidentiality."
So, I mean, I alluded to this. I think there are clearly different professional responsibilities, and we will continue as we engage these new partnerships to engage those questions. And of course, everyone receiving health treatment wants to feel that information that they share is being dealt with responsibly. We have good experiences of clinicians working with us on individual cases, and we have, as you would expect, we have instances where clinicians have played an important part in identifying or responding to risks. We've probably worked through this to a greater extent with the education sector, and I think the reason why we see so many referrals in relative terms from schools and colleges, that we've built confidence in the education sector, that the interventions that come will not all be the hard interventions, will not all be about investigations and enforcement, but will be about safeguarding. And we've got to continue to work with the health sector to make sure that we have appropriate respect for patient confidentiality, of course, because we want people to access healthcare, and we want these people we're talking about to access healthcare, of course. But we will, of course, need to continue to work to overcome those real heartfelt concerns that people have in healthcare around balancing that with also, protecting individuals' proper rights to privacy and their proper professional responsibility. So it's a great question to end on, because it's one of those challenges which we'll continue to work with. But as I say, I'm really positive about the progress we're beginning to make, grateful for the support of many professionals, and interested to know how we continue to have this conversation with the public, of course, because ultimately the information we're talking about, whether it's online information or in people's health records or in their interactions with other services, their information. And if we are going to use that to protect the public, then we absolutely need to do that in a way which has the confidence and trust of that public we're trying to protect.
Matt, thank you very much indeed for a truly excellent lecture this evening, and for being so open in the responses to the questions that have come from the attendees this evening. I've always admired senior colleagues that have taken on the role of the Assistant Commissioner Specialist Operations. I think you've got an incredibly tough job, but I have great confidence in you as an individual and what you've already done and what you will do in the future. So thank you for giving your time this evening. I really appreciate it. And we would all wish you well in the future. Matt Jukes, thank you very much indeed.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.